Burn me, where are those archers?
Rodel Ituralde climbed up to the top of the hillside.
I wanted them formed up on the forward towers an hour ago to relieve the crossbowmen.
Before him, the battle clanged and screamed and grunted and thumped and roared. A band of Trollocs had surged across the river, crossing on ford rafts and a crude floating bridge fashioned from log rafts. Trollocs hated crossing water. It took a lot to get them over, which was why this fortification was so useful. The hillside sloped directly down to the only ford of reasonable size in leagues. To the north, Trollocs boiled through a pass out of the Blight and ran right into the river Aranel. When they could be forced across, they faced the hillside, which had been dug with trenches, piled with bulwarks, and set with archer towers at the top. There was no way to reach the city of Maradon from the Blight except by passing over this hill. It was an ideal position for holding back a much larger force, but even the best fortifications could be overrun, particularly when your men were tired from weeks of fighting. The Trollocs had crossed and fought their way up the slope under a hail of arrows, falling into the trenches, having difficulty surmounting the high bulwarks. The hillside had a flat area at the top, where Ituralde had his command position in the upper camp. He called orders as he looked down on the woven mass of trenches, bulwarks, and towers. The Trollocs were dying to pikemen behind one of the bulwarks. Ituralde watched until the last Trolloc, an enormous ram-faced beast, roared and died with 3 pikes in its gut. It looked as if another surge was coming, the Myrddraal driving another mass of Trollocs through the pass. Enough bodies had fallen in the river that it was clogged for the moment, running red, the carcasses providing a footing for those running up behind.
Archers!
Ituralde bellowed.
Where are those bloody...
A company of archers finally ran past, some of the reserves he'd held back. Most of them had the coppery skin of Domani, though there were a few stray Taraboners mixed in. They carried a wide variety of bows, narrow Domani longbows, serpentine Saldaean short bows scavenged from guard posts or villages, even a few tall Two Rivers longbows.
Lidren!
Ituralde called. The young, hard-eyed officer hurried across the hillside to him. Lidren's brown uniform was wrinkled and dirty at the knees, not because he was undisciplined, but because there were times when his men needed him more than his laundry did.
Go with those archers to the towers, Ituralde said. Those Trollocs are going to try another push. I do not want another fist breaking through to the top, hear me? If they seize our position and use it against us, I'm going to have a rotten morning.
Lidren didn't smile at the comment, as he once might have. He didn't smile much at all anymore, usually only when he got to kill a Trolloc. He saluted, turning to jog after the archers. Ituralde turned and looked down the backside of the hill. The lower camp was set up there, in the shadow of the steep hillside. This hill had been a natural formation once, but the Saldaeans had built it up over the years, with one long slope extending toward the river and a steeper one on the opposite side. In the lower camp, his troops could sleep and eat, and their supplies could be protected, all sheltered from enemy arrows by the steep hillside upon which Ituralde now stood. Both of his camps, upper and lower, were patchwork things. Some of the tents had been purchased from Saldaean villages, some were of Domani make, and dozens had been brought in by gateway from all over the land. A large number of them were enormous Kyrianan things with striped patterns. They kept the rain off his men, and that was enough. The Saldaeans certainly knew how to build fortifications. If only Ituralde had been able to persuade them to leave their hiding place in the city of Maradon and come help.
Now, Ituralde said, where in...
He cut off as something darkened the sky. He barely had time to curse and duck away as a group of large objects rained down, arching high to fall on the upper camp, eliciting howls of pain and confusion. Those weren't boulders. They were corpses. The hulking bodies of dead Trollocs. The Shadowspawn army had finally set up their trebuchets. A part of Ituralde was impressed that he'd driven them to it. The siege equipment had undoubtedly been brought to assault Maradon, which was a little to the south. Setting up the trebuchets across the ford to assault Ituralde's lines instead not only would slow the Shadowspawn, but would expose their trebuchets to his counterfire. He hadn't expected them to hurl carcasses. He cursed as the sky darkened again, more bodies falling, knocking down tents, crushing soldiers.
"Healers!"
Ituralde bellowed.
"Where are those Ashaman?"
He'd pushed the Ashaman hard since this siege had begun, to the brink of exhaustion. Now he held them back, using them only when Trolloc assaults got too close to the upper camp.
"Sir!"
A young messenger with dirt under his fingernails scrambled up from the front lines. His Domani face was ashen, and he was still too young to grow a proper mustache.
"Captain Finsis reports the Shadowspawn army moving trebuchets into range. There are 16 by his count."
"Let Captain Finsis know that his bloody timing could be better,"
Ituralde growled.
"I'm sorry, my lord. They rolled them down through the pass before we figured out what was going on. The initial volley hit our watch post. Lord Finsis himself was wounded."
Ituralde nodded. Rajabi was arriving to take command of the upper camp and organize the wounded. Below, a lot of bodies had hit the lower camp too. The trebuchets could get the height and range to launch over the hill and fall down on his men in their previously sheltered area. He'd have to pull the lower camp back, farther across the plain toward Maradon, which would delay response times. Bloody ashes. I never used to swear this much, Ituralde thought. It was that boy, the Dragon Reborn. Randall Thor had given Ituralde promises, some spoken, some implied. Promises to protect Domani from the Shonchan. Promises that Ituralde could live rather than die trapped by the Shonchan. Promises to give him something to do, something important, something vital, something impossible. Hold back the shadow. Fight until help arrived. The sky darkened and Ituralde ducked into the command pavilion, which had a wooden roof as a precaution against siege weapons. He'd feared spray shot of smaller rocks, not carcasses. The men scattered to help pull the wounded down to the relative safety of the lower camp, and from there across the plain toward Maradon. Rajabi led the effort. The lumbering man had a neck as thick as a 10-year-grown ash and arms nearly as wide. He now hobbled as he walked, his left leg hurt in the fighting and amputated beneath the knee. Aes Sedai had healed him as best he could, and he walked on a peg. He'd refused to retire through gateways with the badly injured, and Ituralde hadn't forced him. You didn't throw away a good officer because of one wound. A young officer winced as a bloated carcass thumped against the top of the pavilion. The officer, Gel, didn't have the coppery skin of a Domani, though he wore a very Domani mustache and a beauty mark on his cheek in the shape of an arrow. They could not hold against Trollocs here for much longer, not with the numbers they were fielding. Ituralde would have to fall back, point by point, farther into Saldaea, farther toward Domani. Odd how he was always retreating toward his homeland, first from the south, now from the northeast. Domani would be crushed between the Shonchan and the Trollocs. You'd better keep your word, boy. He couldn't retreat into Maradon, unfortunately. The Saldaeans there had made it quite clear they considered Ituralde and the Dragon Reborn to be invaders. Bloody fools. At least he had a chance to destroy those siege engines. Another body hit the top of the command pavilion, but the roof held. From the stink, and in some cases splash, of those deceased Trollocs, they'd not chosen the newly dead for this assault. Confident that his officers were seeing to their duties, now was not the time to interfere. Ituralde clasped his hands behind him. Seeing him, soldiers both inside and out of the pavilion stood a little straighter. The best of plans lasted only until the first arrow hit, but a determined, unyielding commander could bring order to chaos by the way he held himself. Overhead, the storm boiled, clouds of silver and black, like a blackened pot, hanging above a cook fire, bits of steel shining through at the edges of the crusted soot. It was unnatural. Let his men see that he did not fear it, even when it hailed corpses upon them. Wounded were carried away, and men in the lower camp began to break it down, preparing to move it further back. He kept his archers and crossbowmen firing, pikemen ready along the bulwarks. He had a sizable cavalry, but couldn't use them here. Those trebuchets, if left alone, would wear his men down with boulders and spray shot, but Ituralde intended to see them burned first, using an Ashaman or a strike force with flaming arrows through a gateway. If only I could retreat into Maradon. But the Saldaean lord there wouldn't let him in. If Ituralde fell back to the city, he'd get smashed against those walls by the Trollocs. Bloody, bloody fools. What kind of idiots denied men refuge when an army of Shadowspawn was knocking on their gates?
I want damage assessments, Ituralde said to Lieutenant Nils. Prepare the archers for an attack on those siege engines, cavalry, and bring 2 of the Ashaman who are on duty. Tell Captain Creedon to watch that Trolloc assault across the ford. They'll redouble their efforts following this barrage, as they'll presume us disordered.
The young man nodded and hastened off as Rajabi limped into the pavilion, rubbing his broad chin.
You guessed right again about those trebuchets. They did set them up to attack us. I always try to guess right, Ituralde said. When I don't, we lose.
Rajabi grunted. Overhead, that storm boiled. In the distance, Ituralde could hear Trollocs calling, war drums beating, men shouting.
Something's wrong, Ituralde said. This whole bloody war is wrong, Rajabi said. We shouldn't be here. It should be the Saldaeans, their whole army, not only the few horsemen the Lord Dragon gave us.
More than that, Ituralde said, scanning the sky. Why carcasses, Rajabi?
To demoralize us.
It was a not unheard-of tactic. But the first volleys? Why not use stones when they do the most damage, and then move to bodies once supplies had been expended? The Trollocs hadn't a mind for tactics, but the Fades. They could be crafty. He'd learned that firsthand. As Ituralde stared at the sky, another massive volley fell, as if spawned by the dark clouds.
Light, where had they gotten that many trebuchets? Enough to throw hundreds of dead bodies.
There are 16 by his count, the boy had said. Not nearly enough. Were some of those carcasses falling too evenly? It hit him like a burst of frozen rain. Those clever, bloody monsters.
Archers!
Ituralde screamed.
Archers, watch the skies! Those aren't bodies!
It was too late. As he yelled, the Drakkar unfurled their wings. Well over half of the carcasses in this volley were living Shadowspawn, hiding among the falling bodies. After the first Drakkar attack on his army a few days back, he'd left archers on permanent rotation watching the skies day and night. But the archers didn't have orders to fire on falling bodies. Ituralde continued to bellow as he leaped out of the pavilion and whipped his sword from its scabbard. The upper camp became chaos as Drakkar dropped amid the soldiers. A large number of them fell around the command pavilion, their 2 large black eyes shining, drawing men toward them with their sweet songs. Ituralde screamed as loud as he could, filling his ears with the sound of his own voice. One of the beasts came for him, but his yell prevented him from hearing its croon. It looked surprised as something so inhuman could look, as he stumbled toward it, pretending to be drawn, then struck an expert thrust through its neck. Dark blood dribbled down across milky white skin as Ituralde yanked his blade free, still screaming. He saw Rajabi stumble and fall to the ground as one of the Shadowspawn leaped on him. Ituralde couldn't go to him. He was confronted by another of the monsters himself. In a blessed moment, he noticed balls of fire striking down Drakkar in the air, the Ashaman. But at the same time, in the distance, he heard the war drums grow louder. As he'd predicted, the churning force of Trollocs would be striking across the ford with as much strength as they ever had. Light, but sometimes he hated being right. "You'd better keep your promise to send me help, boy," Ituralde thought as he fought the second Drakkar, his screaming growing hoarse. "Light, but you'd better."
The city has been emptied of most civilians, Yurli said as he and Ituralde walked through Maradon's gate. We're close to the Blight. This is not the first time we've evacuated. My own sister Sigrun leads the last riders, who will watch from the ridge to the southeast and send word if we should fall. She will have sent word to our watchposts around Saldaean requesting aid. She will light a watchfire to alert us if they come."
The lean-faced man looked at Ituralde, his expression grim.
"There will be few troops who could come to our aid. Queen Tenobia took many with her when she rode to find the dragon reborn."
Ituralde nodded. He walked without a limp. Antail, one of the Ashaman, was quite skilled with healing. His men made a hasty camp in the courtyard just inside the city gates. The Trollocs had taken the tents they'd left behind, then lit them on fire at night to illuminate them feasting on the wounded. Ituralde had moved some of his troops into the empty buildings, but he wanted others close to the gate in case of an assault. The Ashaman and Aes Sedai had worked to heal Ituralde's men, but only the worst cases could get attention. Ituralde nodded to Antail, who was working with the wounded in a roped-off section of the square. Antail didn't see the nod. He concentrated, sweating, working with a power Ituralde didn't want to think about.
"Are you certain you want to see them?"
Yurli asked. He held a horseman's long spear on his shoulder, the tip tied with a triangular black and yellow pendant. It was called the Trader's Banner by the Saldaeans here. The city bristled with hostility, different groups of Saldaeans regarding one another with grim expressions. Many wore strips of black cloth and yellow cloth twisted about one another and tied to their sword sheaths. They nodded to Yurli.
"Desja gavane sierta quendar esain Carenton,"
Ituralde thought, a phrase in the old tongue. It meant, "A resolute heart is worth 10 arguments." He could guess what that banner meant. Sometimes a man knew what he must do, though it sounded wrong. The two of them walked for a time through the streets. Maradon was like most Borderland cities. Straight walls, square buildings, narrow streets. The houses looked like fortressed keeps, with small windows and sturdy doors. The streets wound in odd ways, and there were no thatched roofs, only slate shingles. Fireproof. The dried blood at several key intersections was difficult to make out against the dark stone, but Ituralde knew what to look for. Yurli's rescue of his troops had come after fighting among the Saldaeans. They reached a nondescript building. There would be no way for an outsider to know that this particular dwelling belonged to Vram Torkumen, distant cousin to the queen, appointed lord of the city in her absence. The soldiers at the door wore yellow and black. They saluted Yurli. Inside, Ituralde and Yurli entered a narrow staircase and climbed 3 flights of stairs. There were soldiers in nearly every room. On the top floor, 4 men wearing the Trader's Banner guarded a large gold-inlaid door. The hallway was dark, narrow windows, a rug of black, green, and red.
"Anything to report, Torrin?"
Yurli asked.
"Not a thing, sir,"
the man said with a salute. He wore long mustaches and had the bowed legs of a man very comfortable in the saddle. Yurli nodded.
"Thank you, Torrin, for all you do." "I will stand with you, sir, and will at the end."
"May you keep your eyes northward but your heart southward, my friend," Yurli said, taking a deep breath and pushing open the door. Ituralde followed. Inside the room, a Saldaean man in a rich red robe sat beside a hearth, sipping a cup of wine. A woman in a fine dress did needlework in the chair across from him. Neither looked up.
"Lord Torkumen,"
Yurli said.
"This is Rodel Ituralde, leader of the Domani army."
The man at the hearth sighed over his cup of wine.
"You do not knock, you do not wait for me to address you first. You come during an hour when I have spoken of my need for quiet contemplation."
"Really, Vram," the woman said, "you expect manners from this man? Now?" Yurli quietly rested his hand on the hilt of his sword. The room held a jumble of furniture. a bed on the side of the room that obviously didn't belong there, a few trunks and standing wardrobes.
"So," Vram said, "Rodel Ituralde, you're one of the great captains. I realize it might be insulting to ask, but I must observe formalities. You realize that by bringing troops onto our soil, you have risked a war?"
"I serve the Dragon Reborn," Ituralde said. "Tarmangaiden comes, and all previous allegiances, boundaries, and laws are subject to the Dragon's will."
Vram clicked his tongue.
"Dragonsworn. I had reports, of course. And those men you employ seemed an obvious hint. But it is still so strange to hear. Do you not realize how utterly foolish you sound?"
Ituralde met the man's eyes. He hadn't considered himself Dragonsworn, but there was no use calling a horse a rock and expecting everyone else to agree.
"Don't you care about invading Trollocs?"
"There have been Trollocs before," Vram said. "There have always been Trollocs."
"The Queen," Yurli said.
"The Queen," Vram interrupted, "will soon return from her expedition to unmask and capture this false dragon. Once that happens, she will see you executed, traitor. You, Rodel Ituralde, will likely be spared because of your station. But I should not like to be your family when they receive the ransom demand. I hope that you have wealth to accompany your reputation. Otherwise, you shall likely spend many of the next years as a general to nothing more than the rats of your cell."
"I see," Ituralde said. "When did you turn to the Shadow?"
Vram's eyes opened wide and he stood.
"You dare name me Darkfriend?"
"I've known some Saldaeans in my time," Ituralde said. "I've called some friends. I've fought against others. But never have I known one who would watch men fight Shadowspawn and not offer to help."
"If I had a sword," Vram said.
"May you burn, Vram Torkumen," Ituralde said. "I came here to tell you that on behalf of the men I lost."
The man seemed shocked as Ituralde turned to go. Yurli joined him, pulling the door closed.
"You disagree with my accusation?"
Ituralde asked, joining the traitor as they returned to the stairs.
"I honestly can't decide if he's a fool or a Darkfriend," Yurli said. "He'd have to be one or the other to not put together the truth from the winter, those clouds, and the rumors that Althor has conquered half the world."
"Then you have nothing to fear," Ituralde said. "You won't be executed."
"I killed my countrymen," Yurli said. "Staged a revolt against my queen's appointed leader and seized command of the city, though I've not a drop of noble blood."
"That'll change the moment Tenobia returns, I warrant," Ituralde said. "You've earned yourself a title for certain."
Yurli stopped in the dark stairwell, lit only from above and below.
"I see that you do not understand. I have betrayed my oaths and killed friends. I will demand execution, as is my right."
Ituralde felt a chill.
"Bloody Borderlanders," he thought.
"Swear yourself to the dragon. He breaks all oaths. Do not waste your life. Fight beside me at the last battle."
"I will not hide behind excuses, Lord Ituralde," the man said, continuing down the steps. "No more than I could watch your men die. Come, let us see to the housing of those Ashaman. I would like very much to see these gateways you speak of. If we could use them to send messages out and bring supplies in, this could be a very interesting siege indeed."
Ituralde sighed, but followed. They didn't speak of fleeing by way of the gateways. Yurli wouldn't abandon his city. And considering it, Ituralde wouldn't abandon Yurli and his men. Not after what they'd gone through to rescue him. This was as good a place as any to make a stand. Better than many a situation he'd been in lately. That was for certain. Rodel Ituralde rolled over in his cot, neck slick with sweat. Had Saldaea always been this hot and muggy? He wished for home, the cool ocean breezes of Bandar Eben. Things felt wrong. Why hadn't the Shadowspawn attacked? 100 possibilities rattled in his mind. Were they waiting for new siege engines? Were they scouting out forests in order to build them? Or were their commanders content with a siege? The entire city was surrounded, but there had to be enough Trollocs out there to overwhelm it now. They had taken to beating drums, all hours. Thump, thump, thump. Steady, like the heartbeat of an enormous animal, the great serpent itself, coiling itself around the city. Dawn was beginning to shine outside. He hadn't turned in until well after midnight. Durham, who commanded the morning watch, had ordered that Ituralde not be disturbed until noon. His tent was in a shadowed alcove of the courtyard. He had wanted to be close to the wall, and had refused a bed. That had been foolish. Though a cot had been fine for him in previous years, he wasn't as young as he'd once been. Tomorrow he'd move. Now, he told himself, sleep. It wasn't that easy. The accusation that he was dragon-sworn left him unsettled. In Daman, he'd been fighting for his king, someone he'd believed in. Now he was fighting in a foreign land for a man he'd met only once. All because of a gut feeling. Light, but it was hot. Sweat ran down his cheeks, making his neck itch. It shouldn't be this hot so early in the morning. It wasn't natural. Those burning drums, still pounding. He sighed, climbed off his sweat-dampened cot. His leg ached. It had for days now. "You're an old man, Rodel," he thought, stripping off his sweaty small clothes and getting out some freshly washed ones. He stuffed his trousers into knee-high riding boots. A simple white shirt with black buttons went on next, and then his gray coat, buttoning straight up to the collar. He was strapping on his sword when he heard hurried footsteps outside, followed by whispers. That conversation grew heated, and he stepped outside just as someone said, "Lord Ituralde will wish to know." "Know what?" Ituralde asked. A messenger boy was arguing with his guards. All three turned toward him sheepishly. "I'm sorry, my lord," Connell said. "We were instructed to let you sleep." "A man who can sleep in this heat must be half lizard, Connell," Ituralde said. "Lad, what's the word?" "Captain Yurley is on the wall, sir," the youth said. Ituralde recognized the young man. He'd been with him from near the beginning of this campaign. "He said you should come." Ituralde nodded. He laid a hand on Connell's arm. "Thank you for watching me, old friend, but these bones aren't so frail as you think." Connell nodded, blushing. The guard fell into place behind as Ituralde crossed the courtyard. The sun had risen. Many of his troops were up. Too many. He wasn't the only one having difficulty sleeping. Atop the wall, he was greeted by a disheartening sight. On the dying land, thousands upon thousands of Trollocs camped, burning fires. Ituralde didn't like to think about where the wood for those fires came from. Hopefully, all of the nearby homesteaders and villagers had heeded the call to evacuate. Yurley stood gripping the crenellated stone of the wall next to a man in a black coat. Deep Badar was senior among the Ashaman whom Althor had given him, one of only 3 who wore both the dragon and the sword pins on his collar. The Andoran man had a flat face and black hair that he wore long. Ituralde had sometimes heard some of the black-coated men mumbling to themselves, but not deep. He seemed fully in control. Yurley kept glancing at the Ashaman. Ituralde didn't feel comfortable with men who could channel either, but they were an excellent tool, and they hadn't failed him. He preferred to let experience instead of rumor rule him. "Lord Ituralde," Deep said. The Ashaman never saluted Ituralde, just Althor.
"What is it?"
Ituralde asked, scanning the hordes of Trollocs. They didn't seem to have changed since he'd bedded down.
"Your man claims to be able to feel something," Yurli said. "Out there." "They have channelers, Lord Ituralde," Deep said. "I suspect at least 6, perhaps more. Men, since I can feel the power they're wielding, doing something powerful. If I squint at the far camps, I think I can sometimes see weaves. But it may be my imagination."
Ituralde cursed.
"That's what they've been waiting for."
"What?" Yurli asked.
"With Ashaman of their own."
"They are not Ashaman," Deep said fervently.
"All right then. With channelers of their own, they can tear this wall down as easily as knocking over a pile of blocks, Yurli. That sea of Trollocs will surge in and fill your streets."
"Not so long as I stand," Deep said.
"I like determination in a soldier, Deep," Ituralde said. "But you look as exhausted as I feel."
Deep shot him a glare. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, and he clenched his teeth, the muscles in his neck and face tense. He met Ituralde's eyes, then took a long, forced breath.
"You are correct," Deep said. "But neither of us can do anything about that."
He raised his hand, doing something that Ituralde couldn't see. A flash of red light appeared over his hand, the signal he used to draw the others to him.
"Prepare your men, General, Captain. It will not be long. We cannot continue to hold that kind of power without consequences."
Yurli nodded, then hurried away. Ituralde took Deep's arm, drawing his attention.
"You Ashaman are too important a resource to lose," Ituralde said. "The dragon sent us here to help, not to die. If this city falls, I want you to take the others and whatever wounded you can and get out. Do you understand, soldier? Many of my men will not like this. But you know it is for the best," Ituralde said. "Don't you?"
Deep hesitated.
"Yes, you are correct, as you so often are. I will get them out."
He spoke in a lower voice.
"This is a hopeless resistance, my lord. Whatever is happening out there, it will be deadly. It galls me to suggest it, but what you have said about my Ashaman applies to your soldiers as well. Let us flee." He said the word flee with bitterness. "The Saldaeans wouldn't leave with us." "I know."
Ituralde considered it. Finally he shook his head.
"Every day we delay up here keeps these monsters away from my homeland a day longer. No, I cannot go deep. This is still the best place to fight. You've seen how fortified those buildings are. We can hold inside for a few days, split apart, keep the army busy. Then my Ashaman could stay and help. You have your orders, son. You follow them. Understand?"
Deep snapped his jaw shut, then nodded curtly.
"I will take..."
Ituralde didn't hear the rest. An explosion hit. He didn't feel it arrive. He was standing with Deep one moment, then found himself on the floor of the wall walk, the world strangely silent around him. His head screamed with pain and he coughed, raising a trembling hand to find his face bleeding. There was something in his right eye. It seared with pain when he blinked. Why was everything so quiet? He rolled over, coughing again, right eye squeezed shut, the other watering. The wall ended a few inches away from him. He gasped. An enormous chunk of the northern wall was simply gone. He groaned, looking back in the other direction. Deep had been standing beside him. He found the Ashaman lying on the wall walk nearby, head bleeding. His right leg ended in a ragged rip of flesh and broken bone above where the knee should have been. Ituralde cursed and stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside the man. Blood was pooling beneath Deep, but he was still twitching, alive. "I need to sound the alarm." Alarm? That explosion would have been alarm enough. Inside the wall, buildings were demolished, crushed by stones flying in a spray away from the hole. Outside, Trollocs were loping forward, carrying rafts to cross the moat. Ituralde pulled the Ashaman's belt off and used it to bind his thigh. It was all he could think to do. His head was still throbbing from the explosion.
The city is lost. Light, it's lost, just like that.
Hands were helping him up. Dazedly, he glanced about. Connell. He'd survived the blast, though his coat was torn to shreds. He pulled Ituralde away while a pair of soldiers took deep. The next minutes were a blur. Ituralde stumbled down the stairs from the wall, nearly pitching headfirst 15 feet onto the cobbles. Only Connell's hands kept him from falling. And then... a tent? A large open-sided tent? Ituralde blinked. A battlefield should not be so quiet. Icy coldness washed over him. He screamed. Sounds assaulted his ears and mind. Screams, rock breaking, trumpets sounding, drums throbbing. Men dying. It all hit him at once, as if plugs had been yanked from his ears. He shook himself, gasping. He was in the sick tent. Antail, the quiet, thin-haired Ashaman, stood above him. Light, but Ituralde felt exhausted. Too little sleep mixed with the strain of being healed. As the sounds of battle consumed him, he found his eyelids treacherously heavy.
"Lord Ituralde," Antail said, "I have a weave that will not make you well, but it will make you think you are well. It could be harmful to you. Do you want me to proceed?"
Ituralde said. The word came out as a mumble.
It's...
"Blood and bloody ashes,"
Antail muttered. He reached forward. Another wave of power washed through Ituralde. It was like a broom sweeping through him, pushing away all of the fatigue and confusion, restoring his senses and making him feel as if he'd had a perfect night's rest. His right eye didn't hurt anymore. There was something lingering deep down, an exhaustion in his bones. He could ignore that. He sat up, breathed in and out, then looked to Antail.
"Now that is a useful weave, son. You should have told me you could do this."
"It's dangerous," Antail repeated. "More dangerous than the women's version, I'm told. In some ways, more effective. You're trading alertness now for a more profound exhaustion later on."
"Later on, we won't be in the middle of a city that is falling to the Trollocs. Light willing, at least."
"Deep?"
"I saw to him first," Antail said, gesturing to the Ashaman lying on a nearby cot, his clothing singed and his face bloodied. His right leg ended in a healed stump, and he appeared to be breathing, though unconscious.
"Connell,"
Ituralde said.
"My lord,"
the soldier said, stepping up. He'd found a squad of soldiers to act as a personal guard.
"Let's investigate this mess,"
Ituralde said. He ran out of the sick tent toward Koramora Palace. The city was in chaos. Groups of Saldaeans and Domani rushing this way and that. Connell, showing foresight, sent a messenger to find Yurli. The palace stood nearby, just before the front gate. Its wall had been damaged in the blast, but the building still looked hale. Ituralde had been using it as a command post. Men would expect to find him here. They ran inside, Connell carrying Ituralde's sword. The belt had been cut free at some point. They climbed to the 3rd floor, then ran out onto a balcony that surveyed the area broken by the blast. As he'd originally feared, the city was lost. The swath of broken wall was being defended by a hastily assembled coalition of defenders. A mounting tide of Trollocs were throwing down rafts on the moat, some beginning to surge forward, followed by fades. Men ran through the streets, disoriented. If he'd had more time to prepare, he could have held, as he'd told Deep. Not now. Light, but this defense has been one disaster after another.
"Get the Ashaman," Ituralde ordered, "and any of my officers you can find. We will organize the men into a retreat through gateways."
"Yes, my lord," Connell said.
"Ituralde, no!"
Yurli burst out onto the balcony, uniform dirtied and ripped.
"You survived,"
Ituralde said, relieved.
"Excellent.
Man, your city is lost. I'm sorry. Bring your men with us and we can... Look,
Ituralde said, pulling Ituralde to the side of the balcony, pointing to the east. A thick column of smoke rose in the distance. A village the Trollocs had burned?
The watchfire,
Ituralde continued.
My sister has seen aid coming. We must stand until they arrive.
Ituralde hesitated.
Ituralde, he said softly. If a force has come, it can't be large enough to stop this horde of Trollocs. And that's assuming it's not a ruse. The Shadowspawn have proven clever in the past. Give us a few hours, Ituralde said. Hold the city with me and send scouts through those gateways of yours to see if a force really is coming. A few hours? Ituralde said. With a hole in your wall? We're overwhelmed, Ituralde. Please, Ituralde pled. Are you not one of those they name Great Captain? Show me what that title means, Lord Rodel Ituralde.
Ituralde turned, back at the broken wall. Behind him, in the palace's top room, he could hear his officers gathering. The line at the wall was fragmenting. It wouldn't be long now. Show me what that means. Perhaps...
Timothy, are you here?
Ituralde bellowed. A red-haired man in a black coat stepped onto the balcony. He'd be in command of the Ashaman now that Deep had fallen.
Here, Lord Ituralde. Gather your men, Ituralde said urgently. Take command of that gap and have the soldiers there retreat. I want the Ashaman to hold the breach. I need a half hour. I want all of your energy, everything you've got, to hit those Trollocs. You hear me? Everything you've got. If you can channel enough to light a candle when this is done, I'll have your hides. Sir, the Ashaman said. Our retreat? Leave Antail in the healing tent, Ituralde said. He can make a large enough gateway for the Ashaman to run. But everyone else, hold that breach.
Timothy dashed away.
Yuri, Ituralde said. Your job is to gather your forces and stop them from running through the city like...
He paused. He'd been about to say, like it's Tarman Bloody Gaiden.
Burn me. Like there is nobody in command. If we are going to hold, we will need to be organized and disciplined. I need 4 cavalry companies formed up in the courtyard in 10 minutes. Give the orders. Yes, my lord, Ituralde said, moving to command so. Oh, Ituralde said, turning. I'm going to need a couple of cartloads of firewood, as many barrels of oil as you can come up with, and all of the wounded in either army who can still run, but who have face or arm wounds. Also get me anyone in the city who's ever held a bow. Go!
Nearly an hour later, Ituralde stood, hands clasped behind his back, waiting. He'd moved in from the balcony to look out a window, as to not expose himself. But he still had a good view of the fighting. Outside the palace, the Ashaman line was finally weakening. They'd given him the better part of an hour, blasting back wave after wave of Trollocs in an awesome display of power. Blessedly, the enemy channelers had not appeared. After that show of power, hopefully, they were drained and exhausted. It felt like dusk, with those oppressive clouds overhead and the masses of figures darkening the hillsides beyond the city. The Trollocs, fortunately, didn't bring ladders or siege towers. Only wave after wave at that breach, whipped into attack by the Murdral. Already some of the black-coated men were limping away from the breach, looking exhausted. The last few threw a final blast of fire interrupting earth, then followed their companions. They left the gap completely open and undefended, as ordered. Come on, Ituralde thought as the smoke cleared. The Trollocs peered through the smoke, climbing over the carcasses of those the Ashaman had killed. The Shadowspawn loped on hooves or thick paws. Some sniffed the air. The streets inside the gap were filled with carefully placed men who were bloodied and wounded. They began to scream as the Trollocs entered, running as commanded. Likely none of their fear was feigned. The scene looked more terrible now that many of the nearby buildings were smoldering, as if from the blast. Roofs on fire, smoke pouring from windows. The Trollocs would know that the slate roofs had been designed not to burn, and laws kept buildings from containing too much wood. Ituralde held his breath. The Trollocs broke, running into the city, howling and roaring. groups breaking apart as they saw the opportunity to pillage and slaughter. The door behind Ituralde slammed open and Yurli hastened in.
"The last ranks are placed. Is it working?"
Ituralde didn't answer. The proof was below. The Trollocs assumed their battle won. The blasting power of the Ashaman had the air of one final stand, and the city appeared to be in chaos. The Trollocs all ran down the streets with obvious glee. Even the Murdroll who entered appeared at ease. The Trollocs avoided the burning buildings and the palace, which was walled. They moved deeper into the city, pursuing the fleeing soldiers down a wide avenue on the eastern side of the city. Carefully piled rubble encouraged the bulk of them down this avenue.
"Do you have aspirations of being a general, Captain Yurli?" Ituralde asked softly.
"My aspirations are not important," Yurli said. "But a man would be a fool not to hope to learn."
"Then pay attention to this lesson, son."
Below, shutters on windows were flung open on buildings along the avenue the Trollocs had taken. Bowmen surged out onto balconies.
"If you ever have so much as an impression that you're doing what your enemy expects you to do, then do something else."
The arrows fell and Trollocs died. Large crossbows that shot quarrels almost the size of spears targeted the Fades, and many could be seen lurching across the pavement, not knowing that they were already dead as scores of Trollocs linked to them fell. Confused, enraged, the still-living creatures began to bellow and pound in the doors of the buildings filled with archers. But as they did so, the thunder began. Hoofbeats. Yurli's best cavalry charged down the streets, lances forward. They trampled the Trollocs, slaughtering them. The city became an enormous ambush. A man couldn't ask for better vantages than those buildings, and the streets were wide enough to allow a charge by those who knew the layout. The Trollocs went from bellowing in joy to screaming in pain, and scrambled over one another in their haste to get away. They entered the courtyard by the broken wall. The Saldaean horsemen followed, their hooves and flanks wet with the noxious blood of the fallen. Men appeared at windows of burning buildings, the fires carefully created in sectioned-off rooms, and began loosing arrows down into the large courtyard. Others tossed new lances to the horsemen, who, re-equipped, lined up and rode into the Trollocs. The arrows stopped falling, and the cavalry made a sweeping charge across the courtyard. Hundreds of Trollocs died, perhaps thousands. Those that didn't die scrambled out of the gap. Most of the Murdroll fled. Those that did not were targets for the archers. Killing one of them could kill dozens of Trollocs linked to them. The Fades went down, many sprouting dozens of arrows.
"I'll give the order to unite and hold the breach again," Yurli said eagerly.
"No," Ituralde said.
"But—"
"Fighting at the breach will gain us nothing," Ituralde said. "Give the orders for the men to move to different buildings, and have the archers take different positions. Are there warehouses or other large buildings that can hide the horsemen? Move them there, quickly. And then we wait."
"They won't be caught again?"
"No," Ituralde said. "But they'll be slow and cautious. If we fight them head-on, we lose. If we hold, bide time, we win. That's the only way out of this, Yurli. To survive until help comes. If it's coming." Yurli nodded. "Our next trap won't kill as many," Ituralde said. "But Trollocs are cowards at heart. The knowledge that any roadway could suddenly turn into a death trap will make them hesitate, and will earn us more time than would losing half of our men holding that wall."
"All right,"
Yurli said. He hesitated.
"But doesn't this mean that they're anticipating us? This phase of the plan will work only because they expect our ambushes."
"I suppose that's true."
"So shouldn't we do something different? You said that if we've got a hint that the enemy knows what we're going to do, we should change plans."
"You're thinking about it too much, son. Go. Do as I commanded."
Yes, my lord."
He hurried away.
This, Ituralde thought, is why I should never teach tactics. It was hard to explain to students that there was a rule that trumped all of the others. Always trust your instincts. The Trollocs would be afraid.
He could use that. He'd use anything they gave him. He didn't like to think too long about that rule, lest he dwell on the fact that he'd violated it already, because his every instinct screamed that he should have abandoned this city hours ago. The city of Maradon burned. Violent, twisting columns of smoke rose from dozens of buildings. The careful city planning kept the fires from spreading too quickly, but did not stop them entirely. Human beings and tinder, they went together. Ituralde crouched inside a broken building, rubble to his left, a small band of Saldaeans to his right. He'd abandoned the palace early on. It had been swarmed with Shadowspawn. He'd left it packed with all the oil they'd been able to find, then had the Ashaman set it aflame, killing hundreds of Trollocs and Fades trapped inside. He glanced out the window of his current hiding place. He could have sworn he'd seen a patch of bare sky out the window, but the ash and smoky haze in the air made it difficult to tell. A building nearby burned so intensely that he could feel the heat through the stone. He used the smoke and the fire. Almost everything on a battlefield could be an advantage. In this case, once Yurli had accepted that the city was lost, they'd stopped defending it. Now they used the city as a killing ground. The streets created a maze that Ituralde, with the help of the Saldaeans, knew, and his enemies did not. Every rooftop was a ridge to give high ground, every alley a secret escape route, every open square a potential trap. The Trollocs and their commanders had made a mistake. They assumed that Ituralde cared about protecting the city. They mistook him. All he cared about now was doing as much damage to them as possible, so he used their assumptions against them. Yes, their army was large, but any man who had ever tried to kill rats knew that the size of his hammer didn't matter, so long as the rats knew how to hide. A hesitant group of the creatures shuffled down the blackened street outside Ituralde's building. The Trollocs snapped and hooted warily at one another. Some sniffed at the air, but the smoke ruined their sense of smell. They completely missed Ituralde and his small band, just inside the building. Hoofbeats rang on the other end of the street. The Trollocs began to shout, and a group hurried to the front, setting wickedly barbed spears down with the butts against the cobbles. Charging that would be death for cavalry. The Trollocs were learning to be more careful. But they weren't learning well enough. The cavalry came into view, revealing one man leading a group of wounded and exhausted horses. A distraction. "Now," Ituralde said. The archers around him sprang up and began shooting out the windows at the Trollocs. Many died. Others spun and charged. And from a side street, a cavalry charge, the horses' hooves covered with rags to dampen sound, galloped out, their approach covered by the louder hooves of the diversionary horses. The Saldaeans ripped through the Trollocs, trampling and killing. The archers whooped and took out swords and axes to finish off the wounded Trollocs. No Fade was with this group, bless the light. Ituralde stood up, a wet handkerchief to his face against the smoke. His weariness, once buried deep, was slowly resurfacing. He was worried that when it hit him, he'd drop unconscious. Bad for morale, that. No, he thought. Hiding in the smoke while your home burns, knowing that the Trollocs are slowly penning you in? That's bad for morale. His men finished off the fist of Trollocs, then hastened to another pre-decided building that they could hide in. Ituralde had about 30 archers and a company of cavalry, which he moved among 5 independent bands of irregular fighters similar to this one. He waved his men back into hiding while his scouts brought him information. Even with the scouts, it was difficult to get a good read on the large city. He had vague ideas of where the strongest resistance was, and sent what orders he could. But the battle was spread over too large an area for him to be able to coordinate the fighting effectively. He hoped Ituralde was well. The Ashaman were gone, escaping at his order through the tiny gateway, only large enough to crawl through, that Antail had made. Since they'd gone, it was hours ago now, there had been no sign of whatever rescuers were supposedly coming. Before the Ashaman left, he'd sent a scout through a gateway to that ridge where the last riders had been said to watch. All that the scout found was an empty camp, the fire burning unattended. Ituralde joined his men inside the new hiding place, leaving his handkerchief, now stained with soot, on the doorknob to give the scouts a clue to his location. Once inside, he froze, hearing something outside. "Hush," he said to the men. They stilled their clinking armor. Footfalls. Many of them. That was a Trolloc band for certain. His men had orders to move silently. He nodded to his soldiers, holding up 6 fingers. Plan number 6. They'd hide, waiting, hoping the creatures would pass them by. If they didn't, if they delayed or started searching the nearby buildings, his team would burst out and broadside them. It was the riskiest of the plans. His men were exhausted, and the cavalry had been sent to another of his group of defenders. But better to attack than be discovered or surrounded. Ituralde sidled up to the window, waiting, listening, breathing shallowly. Light, but he was tired. The group marched around the corner outside, footfalls in unison. That was odd. Trollocs didn't march so regularly. "My lord," one of his men whispered. "There aren't any hooves." Ituralde froze. The man was right. His tiredness was making him stupid. That's an army of hundreds, he thought. He got to his feet, coughing despite himself, and pushed open the door. He stepped outside. A gust of wind blew down the street as Ituralde's men piled out behind him. The wind cleared the smoke for a moment, revealing a large troop of infantry, kitted out in silvery armor and carrying pikes. They seemed ghosts for a moment, glowing in a phantom golden light from above, a sun he had not seen in months. The newcomers began to call as they saw him and his men, and 2 of their officers charged up to him. They were Saldaean.
"Where is your commander?" one asked. "The man Rodel Ituralde."
"Aye." Ituralde found himself coughing.
"I am he. Who are you?"
"Bless the light," one of the men said, turning back to the others.
"Pass the word to Lord Bashere. We've found him."
Ituralde blinked. He looked back at his filthy men, faces blackened with soot. More than a few had an arm in a sling. He'd started with 200. Now there were 50. They should be celebrating, but most of them sat down on the ground, closing their eyes. Ituralde found himself laughing.
"Now? The dragon sends help now?"
He stumbled, then sat down, staring up at the burning sky. He was laughing, and he could not stop. Soon tears began streaking down his cheeks. Yes, there was sunlight up there. Ituralde had regained some composure by the time the troops led him into a well-defended sector of the city. The smoke here was much less thick. Supposedly, Althor's troops, led by Davram Bashere, had reclaimed most of Maradon. What was left of it? They'd been putting out the fires. It was so odd to see troops with shiny armor, neat uniforms, clean faces. They'd swept in with large numbers of Ashaman and Aes Sedai, and an army that, for now, had been enough to drive the Shadowspawn back to the hillside fortifications above the river. Althor's men led him to a tall building inside the city. With the palace burned out, mostly destroyed, it looked like they'd picked this building as a command center. Ituralde had been fighting a draining war for weeks now. Althor's troops seemed almost too clean. His men had been dying while these men washed and slept and dined on hot food. Stop it, he told himself, entering the building. It was far too easy to blame others when a battle went wrong. It wasn't the fault of these men that their lives had been easier than his recently. He labored up the stairs, wishing they'd let him be. A good night's sleep, a wash, and then he could meet with Bashere. But no, that wouldn't do. The battle wasn't over, and Althor's men would need information. It was just that his mind was failing him, working very slowly. He reached the top floor and followed Bashere's soldiers into a room to the right. Bashere stood there, wearing a burnished breastplate without the matching helmet, hands clasped behind his back as he looked out the window. He wore one of those overly large Saldaean mustaches and a pair of olive trousers stuffed into knee-high boots. Bashere turned and started.
"Light, you look like death itself, man."
He turned to the soldiers.
"He should be in the healer's tent. Someone fetch an Ashaman."
"I'm all right," Ituralde said, forcing sternness into his voice.
"I look worse than I feel, I'd warrant."
The soldiers hesitated, looking to Bashere.
"Well," the man said, "at least get him a chair and something to wipe his face with. You poor fellow. We should have been here days ago."
Outside, Ituralde could hear the sounds of distant battle. Bashere had chosen a tall building, one from which he could survey the fighting. The soldiers brought a chair, and, for all his wish to show a strong face to a fellow general, Ituralde sat with a sigh. He looked down and was amazed to see how dirty his hands were, as though he'd been cleaning a hearth. No doubt his face was soot-covered, streaked with sweat, and there was likely still dried blood on it. His clothing was ragged from the blast that had destroyed the wall, not to mention a hastily bandaged cut on his arm.
"Your defense of this city was nothing short of stunning, Lord Ituralde,"
Bashere said. There was a formality to his tone. Saldaea and Aradaman were not enemies, but two strong nations could not share a border without periods of animosity.
"The number of Trollocs dead compared to the number of men you had, and with a gap that large in the wall? Let me say that I'm impressed."
Bashere's tone implied that such praise was not easily given.
"What of Yurli?"
Ituralde asked. Bashere's expression grew grim.
"My men found a small band defending his corpse. He died bravely, though I was surprised to find him in command, and Torkumen, a distant cousin of mine, the presumed leader of the city, locked in his rooms and abandoned where the Trollocs could have gotten him." "Yurli was a good man," Ituralde said stiffly. "Among the bravest I've had the honor of knowing. He saved my life, brought my men into the city against Torkumen's orders. It's a burning shame to lose him. A burning shame. Without Yurli, Maradon wouldn't stand right now." "It hardly stands anyway,"
Bashere said somberly. Ituralde hesitated. "He's uncle to the Queen. This city is probably his home." The two looked at one another, like old wolves, leaders of rival packs. Stepping softly. "I'm sorry for your loss," Ituralde said.
"The city stands as well as it does," Bashere said, "because of you. I'm not angry, man. I'm saddened, but not angry. And I'll take your word on Yurli. To be frank, I never liked Torkumen. For now I've left him in the room where we found him, still alive, thankfully, though I'll hear thunder from the Queen for what's been done to him. She's always been fond of him. Bah! She normally has better judgment."
Bashere nodded to the side when he spoke of Torkumen, and, with a start, Ituralde realized that he recognized this building. This was Torkumen's home, where Yurli had brought Ituralde on his first day in the city. It made sense to choose this building as a command post. It was close enough to the northern wall to have a good view of the outside, but far enough away from the blast to have survived, unlike the council hall. Well, it would have served Torkumen right if the Trollocs had gotten him. Ituralde sat back, closing his eyes as Bashere consulted with his officers. Bashere was capable, that much was obvious. Very quickly he'd swept the city clean. Once the Trollocs had realized that there was a larger force to fight, they'd abandoned the city. Ituralde could feel pride that, in part, his tenacity was what had made them so quick to run. Ituralde continued to listen. Most of Bashere's troops had come into the city through gateways, after sending in one scout to find safe places to make them. Fighting in the streets wouldn't work for him as it had Ituralde. The hit-and-hide tactic had been devoted to doing as much damage as possible before getting killed. It was a losing tactic. The Trollocs had pulled back into the fortifications, but they wouldn't stay there for long. As he sat with closed eyes, struggling to stay awake, Ituralde heard Bashere and his captains come to the same dire conclusion Ituralde had. Maradon was lost. The Shadowspawn would wait for night, then swarm in again. After all this, they'd just flee? After Yurli had died holding the city? After Rajabi had been killed by a Drakkar? After Anker and Rossin had fallen during the skirmishes inside the walls? After all the bloodshed, they finally saw help arrive, only to have it prove insufficient. "Perhaps we could push them off that hilltop," one of Bashere's men said. "Clean out the fortifications." He didn't sound very optimistic. "Son," Ituralde said, forcing his eyes open, "I held that hill for weeks against a superior force. Your people built it up well, and the problem with well-built fortifications is that your enemy can turn them against you. You'll lose men attacking there. A lot of them." The room fell silent. "We leave then," Bashere said. "Naif, we'll need gateways." "Yes, Lord Bashere." Square-faced and lean of build, the man wore the black coat and the dragon pin of an Ashaman. "Mullane, gather the cavalry and organize them outside. Make it look as if we're going to try an assault against their fortifications. That'll keep them eager and waiting. We'll evacuate the wounded, then we'll have the cavalry charge in the other direction into—" "By the light in my hope for rebirth!" a voice suddenly exclaimed. Everyone in the room turned in shock. That wasn't the sort of oath you heard every day. A young soldier stood by the window, looking out with a looking-glass. Bashere cursed and hurried to the window, the others crowding around, several taking out looking-glasses. What now? Ituralde thought, standing despite his fatigue and hurrying over. What could they possibly have come up with? More Drakkar? Darkhounds? He peered out the window, and someone handed him a looking-glass. He raised it, and as he'd guessed, the building was on enough of a rise to look out over the city wall and onto the killing field outside and the beyond. The tower positions on the crest of the hill were clustered with ravens. Through the glass he could see Trollocs clogging the heights, holding the upper camp, the towers, and the bulwarks there. Beyond the hill, surging down through the pass, was an awesome force of Trollocs, many times the number that had assaulted Maradon. The wave of monsters seemed to continue on forever. "We need to go," Bashere said, lowering his looking-glass. "Immediately." "Light," Ituralde whispered. "If that force gets past us, there won't be anything in Saldaea and/or Aradoman that can stop it. Please tell me the Lord Dragon made peace with the Shonchan as he promised." "In that," a quiet voice said from behind, "as in so many other things, I have failed." Ituralde spun, lowering his looking-glass. A tall man with red gold hair stepped into the room, a man whom Ituralde felt he had never met before despite the familiar features. Randolph Thor had changed. The Dragon Reborn had that same self-confidence, that same straight back, that same attitude expecting obedience. And yet at the same time, everything seemed different. The way he stood, no longer faintly suspicious. The way he studied Ituralde with concern. Those eyes, cold and emotionless, had once convinced Ituralde to follow this man. Those eyes had changed too. Ituralde had not noted wisdom in them before. Don't be a thick-headed fool, Ituralde thought. You can't tell if a man is wise by looking at his eyes. And yet he could. Rodel Ituralde, Althor said, stepping forward and laying a hand on Ituralde's arm. I left you and your men stranded and overwhelmed. Please forgive me. I made this choice myself, Ituralde said. Oddly, he felt less tired than he had just moments ago. I have inspected your men, Althor said. There are so few left, and they are broken and battered. How did you hold this city? What you have done is a miracle. I do what needs to be done. You must have lost many friends. Yes. What other answer was there? To dismiss it as nothing would be to dishonor them. Wakeda fell today. Rajabi, well, a Drakkar got him. Ankar, he lasted until this afternoon. Never did find out why that trumpeter sounded early. Rawson was looking into it. He's dead too. We need to get out of the city, Bashir said, his voice urgent. I'm sorry, man. Maradon is lost. No, Althor said softly. The Shadow will not have this city. Not after what these men did to hold it. I will not allow it. An honorable sentiment, Bashir said, but we don't... He trailed off as Althor looked at him. Those eyes, so intense. They seemed almost alight. They will not take this city, Bashir, Althor said, an edge of anger entering his quiet voice. He waved to the side, and a gateway split the air. The sounds of drums and Trollocs yelling grew closer suddenly. I'm tired of letting him hurt my people. Pull your soldiers back. With that, Althor stepped through the gateway. A pair of Aiel maidens hurried into the room, and he left the gateway open long enough for them to leap through behind him. Then he let it vanish. Bashir looked stunned, mouth half open. Curse that man, he finally said, turning to the window again. I thought he wasn't going to do this sort of thing any longer. Ituralde joined Bashir, raising his looking glass, looking out through the enormous gap in the wall. Outside, Althor was crossing the trampled ground, wearing his brown cloak and followed by the two maidens. Ituralde thought he could hear the sounds of howling Trollocs. Their drums beat. They saw 3 people alone. The Trollocs surged forward, charging across the ground. Hundreds, thousands. Ituralde gasped. Bashir uttered a quiet prayer. Althor raised one hand, then thrust it, palm forward toward the tide of Shadowspawn. And they started to die. It began with waves of fire, much like the ones Ashaman used. Only these were far larger. The flames burned terrible swaths of death through the Trollocs. They followed the course of the land, seeping up the hill and down into the trenches, filling them with white-hot fire, searing and destroying. Clouds of Drakkar spun in the sky, diving for Althor. The air above him turned blue, and shards of ice exploded outward, spraying the air like arrows from the bows of an entire banner of archers. The beasts shrieked their inhuman agony, carcasses tumbling to the ground. Light and power exploded from the Dragon Reborn. He was like an entire army of channelers. Thousands of Shadowspawn died. Death gates sprang up, striking across the ground, killing hundreds. The Ashaman Nath, standing beside Bashir, gasped. I've never seen so many waves at once, he whispered. I can't track them all. He's a storm of light and streams of power. Clouds began to form and swirl above the city. The wind picked up, howling, and lightning struck from above. Blasts of thunder overpowered the sounds of drums as Trollocs tried in vain to get to Althor, climbing over the burning carcasses of their brethren. The swirling white clouds crashed into the black, boiling tempest, intermingling. Wind spun around Althor, whipping at his cloak. The man himself seemed to be glowing. Was it the reflection of the swaths of fire, or perhaps the lightning blasts? Althor seemed brighter than them all, his hand upraised against the Shadowspawn. His maidens hunched near the ground on either side of him, eyes forward, shoulders set against the great wind. Clouds, spinning about one another, made funnels into the masses of Trollocs, sweeping across the top of the hill, taking up the creatures into the air. Great waterspouts rose behind, made of flesh and fire. The beasts rained down, falling upon the others. Ituralde watched with awe, the hair on his arms and head rising. There was an energy to the very air itself. A scream came from nearby. Within the building, in one of the nearby rooms. Ituralde did not turn away from the window. He had to watch this beautiful, terrible moment of destruction and power. Waves of Trollocs broke, the drums faltering. Entire legions of them turned and fled, stumbling up the hillside and over one another, fleeing back toward the blight. Some remained firm, too angry, too intimidated by those driving them, or too stupid to flee. The tempest of destruction seemed to come to a peak, flashes of light blasting down in time with howling wind, drumming waves of burning flame, tinkling shards of ice. It was a masterwork, a terrible, destructive, wonderful masterwork. Althor lifted his hand toward the sky. The winds grew faster, the lightning strikes larger, the fires hotter. Trollocs screamed, moaned, howled. Ituralde found himself trembling. Althor closed his hand into a fist, and it all ended. The last of the wind-seized Trollocs dropped from the sky like leaves abandoned by a passing breeze. Everything fell silent. The flames died, the black and white clouds cleared, and opened to a blue sky. Althor lowered his hand. The field before him was piled with carcasses atop carcasses. Tens of thousands of dead Trollocs smoldering. Directly before Althor, a pile 100 paces wide formed a ridge 5 feet tall, a mound of dead that had nearly reached him. How long had it taken? Ituralde found that he could not gauge the time, though looking at the sun, at least an hour had passed, perhaps more. It had seemed like seconds. Althor turned to walk away. The maidens rose on shaky feet, stumbling after him. "What was that scream?" Nath asked. "The one nearby, in the building. Did you hear it?" Ituralde frowned. What had that been? He crossed the room, the others, including several of Bashere's officers, following. Many others stayed in the room, however, staring out at the field that had been cleansed by ice and by fire. It was odd, but Ituralde hadn't been able to spot a single fallen tower atop the hill. It was as if Althor's attacks had somehow affected only the Shadowspawn. Could a man really be that precise? The hallway outside was empty, but Ituralde had a suspicion now of where the scream had come from. He walked to Lord Torkumen's door. Bashere unlocked it, and they went inside. It seemed empty. Ituralde felt a spike of fear. Had the man escaped? He pulled out his sword. No. A figure was huddled in the corner beside the bed, fine clothing wrinkled, doublet stained with blood. Ituralde lowered his sword. Lord Torkumen's eyes were gone. He appeared to have put them out with a writing quill. The bloodied implement lay on the ground beside him. The window was broken. Bashere glanced out it. "Lady Torkumen is down there." "She jumped," Torkumen whispered, clawing at his eye sockets, fingers covered with blood. He sounded dazed. "That light, that terrible light." Ituralde glanced at Bashere. "I cannot watch it," Torkumen muttered. "I cannot. Great Lord, Where is your protection? Where are your armies to rend, your swords to strike? That light eats at my mind, like rats feasting on a corpse. It burns at my thoughts. It killed me. That light killed me.
He's gone mad, Bashere said grimly, kneeling down beside the man. Better than he deserved, judging by those ramblings. Light, my own cousin, a Darkfriend, and in control of the city.
What is he talking about? One of Bashere's men said. A light? Surely he couldn't have seen the battle. None of these windows faced the right way.
I'm not sure he was talking about the battle, Vogler, Bashere said. Come on. I suspect the Lord Dragon is going to be tired. I want to see that he's cared for.